What is up, everyone? Welcome back to my channel. I'm Mason Nova, and today I'll be showcasing my very first lore video. I'm really excited to do this. I love the story of Ark, and honestly, this is very overdue for me. We're going to be talking about the explorer notes left behind by the original caretakers of the Genesis ship, stories when it was first engineered, and we're even going to get a small glimpse of what Ark 2 may have in store for us. As per the status quo, we're given entries from the perspective of 4 different individuals. These main characters are the warrior Santiago, the free-spirited youngling named Nida, and a future colonist known as Gabriel. We also have some information from HLNA, but it's so minor and brief I did not end up including it in this video. I might do one on her in the future. We'll see. Now, for anyone raising an eye at Santiago's presence on this ship, given that he was heavily implied to have sacrificed his life on Earth, which we can read about in the Extinction DLC, that is in fact the same Santiago. And even the very same man featured in the Ark 2 trailer, which appears to take place on an alien homeworld, whose likeness was borrowed from Vin Diesel. Well, you're not alone in this concern. We'll be clearing up the chronological order of Santiago's life and getting into the fine details in his entries. As for Nida and Gabriel's story, they intertwine heavily, as you're going to see. Nida is a soil scientist who has a genuine passion for virtual reality, and Gabriel, as I mentioned, is a colonist who is simply woken up a little early. So before we delve into the Explorer notes, there's some pertinent questions that we need to answer. What was the purpose of the Genesis simulation exactly? Who created the ARKs and this Genesis starship, and more importantly, why? To find that answer, we're going to have to go back to Earth briefly. When Element was first discovered in a time long before Genesis or the conception of the ARKs, it was recognized by humanity as this miracle metal due to its unrivaled ability to provide fuel, discharge as a powerful weapon, and provide an unparalleled quantity of apparently clean energy with which to power an entire civilization. Element was even argued to have been gifted to humans by a higher, more divine power. During this time of discovery, there were 2 major powers on Earth: the Terran Federation and the United Republics of Earth, often referred to as the URE. Now, the Federation wanted to utilize Element as a clean energy and sweep up the mess of a biosphere they had created in the past, and use it to supplement a serious lack of resources for the people. They hoped to enter a sort of new utopia of infinite resources, while the URE delved into the technological realm of possibility, realizing they could transfer human consciousness into other bodies or machines that they would call transhumans or homo deus. Unable to compromise and holding a seriously unhealthy hatred of their counterparts' ideology, these 2 factions began warring over this material in a race to gain superiority over the other. But soon after all human civilization became reliant on this super substance, it was discovered it had catastrophic negative consequences. It began poisoning plants and forests, but instead of just killing the life, it did something arguably much worse. It began changing it and mutating entire ecosystems to be incompatible with human existence, poisoning the air they breathed, turning crops and farm animals into piles of radioactive goo. When Element enters a human's bloodstream, it begins driving them into a deep madness, as it did Rockwell on Aberration. Previously thought to be an inorganic material, Element began growing itself in large quantities, emerging as giant stalks out of the ground and digging into the Earth's crust, infecting it with a sort of cancer that would undoubtedly one day consume the entire planet. The Federation and URE realized this chilling planetary fate far too late, but they decided to cooperate and come up with a potential solution. Once again, they were unable to agree on what to do, but each faction did come up with their own unique way to outlive this element crisis, and with a lasting truce, they could now focus all their efforts on this attempt to escape extinction. The URE decided they would take a page from a biblical story called Noah's Ark that I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with, and created arks of their own. They envisioned a people who would be forced to deal with survival problems on a daily basis in these biodomes. Those people would surely die, and then they would allow them to come back to life to try again in an endless cycle until they gained adequate survival skills. They would then be archived digitally until eventually, if Earth was ever habitable again, these arks would descend down, and then they would open up, allowing its inhabitants to leave with their newfound survival skills to retake the planet and rebuild human civilization. The Federation believed Earth was beyond the event horizon of healing the planet from this cancer-like element, so they thought the Arks would never actually open and people would be trapped in there until the biodomes malfunctioned, causing its own destruction and eventually the loss of all souls in the archives. So they instead decided to build a starship, one that could venture out into the galaxy and search for a new home. The ship was the beginning for humans, a new Genesis for which it was then named. So the plan was simply this. Genesis flies through space with a remnant of life from Earth. They would have human ship caretakers who would conduct maintenance operations and ensure the ship would one day reach a destination, a new planet. The Federation also realized that landing on a new planet would have new challenges that they never foresaw. They needed people, colonists, who were ready for anything, and thus began the creation of the Genesis simulation. While some humans existed on the plane of reality, others would stay in the simulation, learning to hone their survival skills and be ready for any threat a new planet could one day pose. That brings us to our first character, Santiago and his time with the Genesis ship. So let me be clear, his entries take place before the ship was launched from Earth, which means that was before any ARKs were ever made. So for anyone who knows Santiago's fate on Earth after escaping the Aberration Ark, this took place in a time way before that. For those of you who don't know, we will be covering it shortly. So, the element was rapidly taking over the planet, and Santiago's entries are from the last days of humanity's presence on the dying world. Santiago was someone who worked for the Federation as a hacker. He also developed military weapons from Element to be used against the United Republics of Earth, so he was a little surprised to find himself working for a URE transhuman, a Homo Deus named Uma. Uma believed that the manifestation of Element on Earth was a sign that a higher power was reaching out to them. She continued to believe this even when the cancer-like effects of Element were well known by everybody. In Santiago's Explorer Note number 3, he revealed something that shocked me personally. He mentioned that humans had little evidence alien life actually existed, only a few amino acids and something similar to chlorophyll, but only in trace amounts. Now, mind you, the Ark 2 trailer revealed that Santiago was born in the 24th century. During that time, they had a very high-tech, extremely futuristic world. His exact quote from the note was that, "There's nothing like definitive proof we're not the only show in town." So for any other people out there that are still claiming aliens for Ark, this theory has been officially debunked. Santiago led a small team of people, one of whom was named Yonki, a URE zealot who notably disputed the transfer of human consciousness and was known to speak out about it with a very passionate anger. Yonki's job was to develop the Genesis simulation, and he had high hopes that the colonists inside the sim would, quote, hit the ground running on their new home planet, unquote. The other underling was a woman named Alicia, an environmentalist who specializes in the transport of energetic compounds. Later, Santiago, again a Federation fighter who at one time fought against the URE and the idea of transhumans, began to see some remnants of humanity in his Homo Deus superior Uma while the two were drinking together at a bar. It wasn't much, a simple smile in response to a bad joke, but it was enough for him to take note. Prior to this, he wasn't even sure that they could smile. Eventually, he spotted Yonki drinking alone, so he invited his underling over. But Yonki was described as acting jittery and anxious, which was strange to Santiago since he's worked around transhumans longer than Santiago himself. He theorized that something else was bothering the kid. This theory became more evident in the coming days, where Yonki would keep conversations awkwardly professional. So on a later night, Santiago invited him to go out drinking. After a few jokes, the kid seemed to lighten up a little bit. Yonki himself showed pictures of his own husband and kids. Eventually he revealed something that Santiago would later say he'd almost wish he hadn't found out. Yonki explained that he heard Santiago was actually killed near the end of the Element War. This was the name of the war fought between the Federation and the URE before the true nature of Element was discovered. Yonki mentioned he even saw a listing for Santiago's engram in the archive that Santiago himself never knew existed. This meant in his death he could be forced to live again, to be resurrected. Now this was not good news to him. It was ominous and deeply unwanted. In fact, his one stipulation for joining the Genesis project was to not archive him for resurrection. Santiago couldn't dwell on this for very long, as a major screw-up by Yonki's division was revealed. Between emulation and archiving personalities, they accidentally entangled two distant personalities together. A gold prospector from Alta California and an Alexandrian occultist from the Roman Principate. This may seem like a minor detail right now, but remember it for later. Santiago rejected Yonki's offer to resign over this ordeal and instead ordered him to have a beer with him in order to wind down. Later, he would confront Uma about his possible death, and she confirmed it to be true. After enduring a wrathful freakout by Santiago, Uma explained his expertise was needed for this Genesis mission, and without it, humanity could become extinct. That the ends justified the means. He felt the URE had, in a way, exacted their revenge for his efforts against them in the Element War, reviving him against his will with their technology. When he confided this in Yonki again about his resurrection, Yonki revealed he had looked into the archive database again and found his own husband and daughters. This act was directly against the grain of Yonki's ideology and presumably his family's. Santiago noted how angry and desperate the kid looked, but he hoped to talk him down just enough after reminding him the URE weren't the enemies anymore. Later, Uma took Santiago aboard the Genesis starship to a place they called the Farm. It was a sanctuary area teeming with life, and he was amazed to feel a connection with a baby mammoth. He held his trunk in his hand and got the impression that neither of them wanted to let go. He said they were, quote, two souls dragged back from oblivion holding on to each other in orbit. After some internal concerns about element infecting the ship, Santiago spotted Alicia, his underling, and asked if they could potentially decontaminate all rock and soil being brought to Genesis, to which she basically replied it was an impossible task. So, Santiago got an idea to create the Strider that we now see roaming Genesis to this day, and designed them to remove contaminated particles from the rings, which would include any traces of the element. Santiago's work on Genesis evolved into him becoming a full believer in their mission. He reveled in the idea that despite all his technology that assisted in poisoning the Earth and the countless people killed with his weaponry, he could find some redemption in knowing that if this mission were successful, he'd have played a key role in preventing the extinction of his entire species. This wonderful feeling of melancholy would soon be interrupted by a request from Yonki to accompany him into the Genesis simulation. Yonki had tweaked the settings in the sim so that the wind in the Arctic region would howl extremely loud, almost as if he were trying to have a secret conversation with Santiago. Yonki leaned in very close to him and asked if Uma had, quote, gotten to him. Santiago told him he was out of line, and after a moment in frozen silence, Yonki asked if he would accompany him to confront Uma about archiving Yonki's family without their consent. Santiago agreed, and had a sore feeling that Yonki may have left him on ice had he declined this offer. During the confrontation, Uma admitted that she was in the wrong for archiving his family against their will, and gave him the same means justified the end spiel that she gave to Santiago. But Uma genuinely wanted to prove to Yonki that she cared about him and his family, so she asked what it was that she could do. Yonki said that she would have to go out drinking with him and Santiago. During their downtime in the booze, Yonki kept trying to pry information out of Uma. Eventually, she leaked a very sobering detail at how little time there was left where Earth could continue to sustain human life. After some thinking, Yonki said that he wished to spend that little time with his family and he wished to resign his position. Uma sort of accepted, but only if he felt the same way when he was sober the next day. So, the next morning, Santiago spotted a pacing Yonki. He was extremely pale and looked troubled, but not due to a hangover. He revealed that he officially had quit, and this weighed very hard on Santiago, who offered him a hug to show he understood. During this embrace, Yonki then whispered something to Santiago that only he could hear. Time seemed to freeze as, half a second later, an explosive vest on Yonki detonated and took Santiago with him in a ferocious blast of superheated plasma. Uma questioned the now archived Santiago in a simulation of that event, asking what Yonki had said to him. Santiago revealed there wasn't enough time for, quote, my neural interface to record whatever the kid said, unquote. He then asked her what Yonki had said when he resigned. Uma replied that Yonki hated that he couldn't stop her from resurrecting his family in the event that they were to pass. Uma thanked Santiago for his work on the ship and wished him better luck in the future, to which Santiago replied, quote, don't worry, I'm a survivor. Santiago was then shut down and his soul was stored in the archive. As we know, he was resurrected on the Aberration Ark and went to Earth after. His fate there was left a little bit of a cliffhanger. It was not clear whether he lived or died, but his journey would later be expounded on at the end cutscene of Genesis Part 2. So if you wish to avoid a spoiler for Part 2's ending, please click on the Nida in the timestamp on the description box to avoid this spoiler. If not, we're going to go ahead and play that for you.
Warning. Catastrophic wiring vulnerability. Failure. All revived life forms require immediate communication.
We respawned again.
Insertion maneuver successful. Stable orbit confirmed. Warning. Emergency evacuation in progress. Docking clamps released. Drop initiated.
Something tells me that this is the easy part.
As you could plainly see, the planet we're arriving at is not Earth, and Santiago just came out of a simulation pod. So this confirms that he had to have died on Earth for his soul to have come back to the Genesis ship. So to find out what happens next for Santiago's story, we're going to have to wait for Ark 2. Alright, next up is going to be Nida. Her story takes place very close to the present time where our characters emerge from the simulation, which means the Genesis starship at this time is actively searching for a new world to reside on. Nida is a young girl, often underestimated for being so young, though it's not stated what her exact age is. She appears to be in the late teens, early 20s. She feels life on Genesis is monotonous and each day is the same. She yearns to see a real sunrise, but compromises her impossible desire by watching a simulated version that she created. Nida resents the fact that an AI, in her mind, condemned her to be a soil scientist, damning her entire existence on the starship to be dedicated to just that. Her genuine passion was coding, and she loved passing time by tinkering with the Genesis simulation. It was during this tinkering that she discovered an anomaly within the sim, which was unheard of at this time. It was something transhuman. A Homo Deus was inside of it. She tried telling her superiors, but apparently no one believed her due to her known childlike love of fantasy. At this time, there was no Homo Deus, not even Uma, on board the Genesis ship. The intruder in the simulation was revealed to be our beloved HLNA, who revealed that she was created by a transhuman, which we know is Ark's protagonist and ascended female lead character Helena. Before Nida could ask too many questions, HLNA removed her from her own sim. After that, she couldn't find HLNA again and stated it was as if she figured out how to digitally conceal herself. Still, no one believed young Nida until glitches began populating in the simulation. Before those could be addressed, cascading faults began to occur on the real-world systems, wreaking havoc and causing great panic among the ship's crew members. Nida's assumption was that HLNA was the cause of the failures occurring in the rings of the starship. She thought it was possible, though quite unlikely, that an angry URE transhuman would try to sabotage their Federation-led mission, given they were far behind them in both time and space. Still, HLNA was her only suspect. The crew began losing people who were trying to stop whatever it was that was attacking the ship, and soon had to seal off what she refers to as the forward ring to prevent the disaster from spreading. In-game, this forward ring is the western ring, if you're referring to your map. Anyway, Nida continued to be shrugged off as a child despite her insistence to provide support. She felt helpless and worse, useless. She concluded the biomes in her ring had not been contaminated yet, which she found some peace in knowing. The leaders began speaking of plans to detach the unaffected ring to ensure that it remains uncontaminated. Nida took it upon herself to use the subterranean system, an underground maintenance network, to get to the infected ring and take some soil samples. But the whole ring looked like an alien world now. Flora and fauna she didn't recognize mutated to the point where it physically reacted to her mere presence. In the end, she wondered why she had worked so hard to sneak in there in the first place. Her entire body was screaming at her that she didn't belong there. She felt panicked, out of place, and severe vertigo simultaneously. Once she collected her samples, she moved to leave the hostile place, but not before seeing something that looked like a big cat to her at first. It was staring at her with this predatory gaze. She couldn't help but notice it had a strange, feathery spines like a venomous tropical fish. And she saw a second one, and then a third. With an instinctive movement, she dove into the tunnel to escape and hastily sealed it behind her. Nida hyperventilated for several minutes before collecting herself and heading back to her ring. While she analyzed her samples, she found herself again wondering who was responsible for the attack on the forward ring. This moment of pondering was interrupted when she discovered her findings in the soil. She knew right away it was extremely bad news. Element, incorporated into organic, mutated tissue. Her findings exasperated the emergency, and engineers frantically began working on detaching their ring from the entire ship. One thought in everyone's mind was what's happening to the colonists in the Genesis simulations on the affected ring. That was something Nida didn't want to think about. She was growing ever more certain that this attack was by HLNA. She desperately tried to re-establish contact and eventually figured out how to find HLNA by getting the sim itself to confirm at least where HLNA wasn't. When she saw the single location that was listed as unconfirmed, she traveled there and immediately found HLNA. She began to plead with the small AI to stop the attack on the ship. Nida's entries don't actually get into what HLNA said back to her. There's only two things that we know for sure. HLNA told her that she wasn't behind the assault and warned Nida that colonists were waking up early. At this point in the story, there is little conscious life left on the Genesis starship, so Nida decided to pack her things and go into hiding in the underground tunnels. Through the ship's surveillance system, she was able to tap into different live feeds and even tried calling out to some engineers before remembering that they couldn't hear her. It was clear the engineering effort to detach the ring had stalled. Something had forced the engineers to leave their work sites. Nida downloaded documents citing the detachment process, but it was well outside of her area of expertise. Beyond that, she knew she couldn't risk the chance that the ring would detach and then slam right back into the main starship. By this point, she was alarmed by the lack of personnel on footage. She began to feel alone in the dark, alone and very afraid. After some time alone, she saw something strange on the surveillance feed. It was a person walking around aimlessly. She realized it had to be a colonist that was woken from the Genesis simulation. Her initial thought was that she felt terrible that someone would wake up from such a thing and have no idea where they were, with no staff to greet them and a strange artificial sun in the sky providing them warmth. She relocated to a subterranean spot very close to the colonists and devised her rescue plan. After fighting back an ominous feeling that this colonist was sent by whatever it was that was attacking the ship, she broadcasted a message directly into his Federation helmet that would lead him to her. She was beside herself with joy at the thought of having company again. She explained through messages in his helmet what was going on and what threat it was that they faced. She wasn't sure exactly how much he understood, but eventually he found her in her hiding place. He took off his helmet and was notably upset that, quote, a kid like her, unquote, risked her neck for him. After telling him off for treating her akin to a child, he offered an apology and a handshake and told her his name, Gabriel. He explained he was a prospector, a miner in his previous life during the gold rush. He had vivid memories of it and was excited to learn the Strider could launch a pulverizing beam for excavation. She felt as though he was almost too interested in the configuration of the creature's head. Needle's final entry unfortunately details her lack of trust in Gabriel. He seemed far too self-involved and something was just, quote, off. This technically marks the end of her entries, but it segues into Gabriel's story nicely, and she's heavily detailed in his writings. Gabriel's first entry details a realm he experienced beyond consciousness that he referred to as Purgatory, which took place seamlessly after his death by raiders who sacked his home and land stake. We know this place obviously is a Genesis simulation. In it, he talks about demons and monsters, and during his struggles, he heard a woman call to him and offer words of encouragement. She wanted him to join her in her fight against her enemy, but a second voice followed, a man's. He called her a liar and promised Gabriel a new life and restitution if he chose him, which Gabriel did. He awoke in a new garden, the Genesis starship, and the voice guided him to his, quote, magical armor. Gabriel wandered for a while before his magical helmet guided him to Nida, who called him a colonizer. He didn't like that castigation, but was impressed someone so young was not afraid of him. She even tended to him, offering food and drink. She explained the dire state of the ship, and her explanation of such advanced ideas and mechanics of this impossible place made Gabriel feel completely out of his own time and just utterly useless. Though his spirit shaped up when he got to see the power of a Strider, but he noticed a violet material, which Nida identified as element. After explaining its many uses, he felt silly to have died over gold. Later that night, Gabriel would have the first of his many dreams. He was heating element and forging it into a dagger. When it was completed, he gazed upon it and noticed his reflection. It wasn't his. He was someone else. A cold, distant voice praised his work on the blade. He then awoke in the garden aboard the Genesis. He wondered what mystic art it was that he dreamed of. Later, Nida showed Gabriel how to tame Striders. They tamed two of their own, but Gabriel chose to ride along with Nida to learn from her rather than ride alone. She spent days teaching him how to operate the Strider, and they finally blasted some rock with its laser. Gabriel noticed a violet shard, and he picked it up and pocketed it before Nida could see. On another night, he dreamed he was in Alexandria on the coast of Egypt. He was carrying an orphan through a massive dark hall of a great, partially flooded catacomb. Suddenly, the orphan on his shoulder began to stir, and he was confused as she fought the effects of the mandrake root. His sheer confusion in that moment caused Gabriel to snap awake. He sat upright, and he saw his strider looking down at him. His dream was so vivid, so real. He looked at his leg in search of the dagger he had on it in his dream, but nothing was there. Later, when Nida was teaching Gabriel about her own history and that of the starship, Gabriel found himself just unable to focus. He only continued to ponder whose eyes it was he was looking through during his dreams. He was more certain now these weren't just dreams, but memories of someone from Alexandria. Nida was gleaming with excitement as she was about to show Gabriel something. She said it was a game from the simulation. She sent him inside, and Gabriel was overwhelmed with sheer confusion. He was now standing on a planet watching a sunset. He wondered if perhaps this was reality and the sky wheels were the simulation. During his thoughts, the same woman from before spoke to him again. She said, quote, "It wasn't too late to let go of the malice in his heart," unquote. After this warning, Gabriel was ripped from the simulation and was back on the starship. He was angry with Nida, for now he could no longer trust his own senses. He didn't know what was real. Nida reacted poorly to his critique. That night, while Gabriel slept, Nida noticed the element shard he kept hidden. When he woke, she demanded to know what he was planning to do with it, warned him against cutting himself with it. After their argument, they didn't speak for some time. He heard the voice that promised him a new life tell him it was his element to keep. It asked him why he waged to fight for her in a battle that wasn't his own. Feeling particularly angry and trapped, Gabriel took advantage of a moment in which Nida was collecting berries with her back facing him. He ran over to his strider and rode it off in the distance. He felt free of her will and was excited to use the machine as he saw fit. Though this moment of freedom and excitement was very short-lived. Gabriel spent an entire day mining on his own, but his thoughts just kept returning to Nida. A guilt began to overwhelm him, and at the next dawn, he just felt angry that he had abandoned a young girl to fight an unfair battle that was certainly going to get her killed. He was upset with himself for not seeing that simulated sunset that she showed him for what it was, for simply showing him what it could look like on a world that he was destined to tame, a world Nida likely thought that she was never going to see herself. Gabriel rushed back to Nida, though he was nervous how she might react when she saw him. But when he caught up to her, she simply paid him no mind. She was tinkering with a podium that eventually opened a large circular metal door. Even after his apology, she didn't look at him. She simply mounted her strider and went through the threshold. Gabriel followed her inside and through a portal which led to a gruesome sight. He saw many warriors of Nida's people, lifeless, hung up on spikes and held up by tentacles. Generations of work had been completely undone here by some unnatural power. Nida's life work had been stripped away and melted to nothingness in an instant. It was definitely a warning to steer away anyone else from approaching. The voice echoed in Gabriel's head once more, telling him he knew what he needed to do. If Gabriel were to do what the voice wanted, he would be made whole again. The voice grew loud and thunderous in his mind. It boomed like lightning striking metallic structure, screaming for Gabriel's obedience. He felt himself pass into a dream state, and he was in Alexandria again along with that same child. But he brought the child to a secret sepulchre as a sacrifice. He was promised vengeance by a lord for his banishment, but Gabriel was unsure if the promise came from the starship, the dream, or from his violet shard of element. Gabriel came back to reality, but the voices continued. Nida didn't seem to hear them, nor did she see him slip away into his daydream. The yelling screeched that they were unwelcome, but Nida still carried on as if everything was normal. Gabriel found himself just in a deep rage at her silence and angrily shouted for her to tell him what it was that she was planning. The yelling was both because he was mad and because the voice screaming at him was just so loud. Nida simply asked him why it was that he was yelling. He was astonished that she really couldn't hear the voice. They were then set upon by what Gabriel calls finned creatures, but the Striders protected Gabriel and Nida while they sought cover behind a rock. Nida started pushing the slimy dirt over and instructed Gabriel to help her. Together they uncovered a hatch and dove inside. They slid ever downward away from their enemies, but soon they were sliding into strange organic material that audibly sloshed as they slid downward. Gabriel tried slowing himself, but it was simply too slippery. He pounded his fist into the metal to no avail. A malignant growth designed purely to scare and disgust anyone who touched it, and Gabriel was absolutely terrified. He turned onto his stomach and took out his elemental dagger and dug it into the thick membrane, cutting them free. The entry specifically referenced this as a dagger, but I found it odd, as it's not mentioned that Gabriel ever actually made this dagger, except for in that dream, but perhaps that wasn't a dream, it was part dream, part reality, and maybe it could just simply be the shard from earlier, and calling it a dagger, I guess, just seems to be an overclassification. Anyway, I digress, back to the story. As he and Nida plummeted into a large, dark open space below, an exhausted Gabriel lost consciousness in the dark room. The next entry took me a while to understand, as it's no longer Gabriel but someone else, someone who had been hiding within him this entire time. This person identified themselves as Ixion, a devout follower of the Egyptian king of the dead, Serapis. He recalled sacrificing the orphan, the girl at the altar, and freeing her from her mortal body to her own holy energy. He pled with his king to give him transcendence as the soldiers of the empire surrounded this Serapis temple in Egypt and would surely cut him down. He then woke from the Genesis simulation. A voice guided him to supernatural armor and said, quote, "Go now and find her," unquote. It's implied but not stated that Ixion stayed dormant in Gabriel's body after getting into the armor, all the way until Gabriel and Nida cut their way out of the long organic slide. But after that entry, number 28, it's up for debate who is actually occupying the body of Gabriel and Ixion. Perhaps a blend of both, I'm very uncertain. The person describes being captured by mounds of ulcerated flesh. There was a tormentor of tentacles and twisted humanoid features demanding the girl give her monstrous children new dreams. It demanded that the Gabriel-Ixion hybrid mine a precious resource he referred to as Edmundium. They each refused. In the final entry, this person does refer to Nida by her name, which makes me think that it is perhaps Gabriel who has control again. As they fought the creature who had them ensnared in this slimy, fleshy trap, it told them that they could not fight it much longer, eventually that their will would give and they would do its bidding regardless. Gabriel felt the tentacle latch violently onto the back of his head, and his will rapidly began to fade. In his final act of life, he remembered the elemental dagger he'd had on him. He threw it to Nida and watched her cut herself free and escape into the darkness as indignant howls followed her. Gabriel's last thoughts in his life of free will was, quote, "Creation deserves its rightful turn in the sun," unquote. Alright, and that's it, guys. Thank you so much for watching. A lot of hours get put into these lore videos, so if you found the content informative, please consider subscribing. If you have any thoughts, I'd love to see them in the comments section. I've been Asa Nova, and I'll see you all next time.